Okay. Can you see me now, everybody? Yes? No? Oh my goodness. This is this is wild. Oh my god. So I was dumb and I forgot to hit the live button. The result of which is that I basically talked and gave like a half hour of this lecture. And then, yeah, and then realized, because I was like, man, you were talking about Skyrim a lot. So, yeah, so there we go. You missed my real good Animal Crossing joke, which I will not repeat because it was just so good. And you missed it. Um, so here's what I'm gonna do. Um, uh, here's what I'm gonna do. Um, I'm basically gonna do like parts 2 and 3 of the talk, and and then I'm gonna type up my notes and put them in our class page because yeah, I am so sorry about that. That was on me. Um, that was on me. So y'all are totally fine. Anyway, um, so just jumping back real quick. So we're talking about The Missing Chapter of Empire by Santiago Castro-Gomez. He is a Colombian philosopher who teaches in Bogota, and he is most famous for a book called The Critique of Latin American Reason, which is not available in English as far as I know. Most of his work is not available in English, unfortunately. He's very, very good. I really, really, every time I read this essay, I love it more. So go figure. Anyway, um, he he comes up with this key concept, and this is the thing that I want. If you take away one thing from this, this is the one thing I want you to take away, and that is the concept of 0 point epistemology. So, Castro Gomez makes a connection to Descartes and to Descartes' way of doing philosophy by referring to it as 0 point epistemology. Now, what does that mean? Well, for Descartes, we have to throw out all knowledge that is not certain, clear, and distinct. And in order to get to certain knowledge, we have to cast aside all subjectivities that might be preferential, that might be based on our senses, that might be based on all kinds of stuff. Um, and we arrive at knowledge that is certain, that is clear, that is precise, and that eventually becomes known as this is legitimate knowledge. It is knowledge from a God's eye view, because it is what is the case, what is true, and no conditions can actually change that. Now, to say that you have knowledge from a God's eye view, one way you could say that would be to say that you are at a 0 point, where if you think about one of those Cartesian uh, sort of like number line things, right, with an x-axis and a y-axis, and you're sort of plotting all these different points. If you're at the 0 point, you're at the exact center, and you can kind of see everything. That is what he means by 0 point epistemology, because there is no perspective from which you are viewing or knowing anything. And if that's the case, right, if that's the case, then you have what he would call a God's eye view. Now, why does he say this is the hubris of a God's eye view? It is hubris because, quite literally, the word hubris means that one puts oneself in the position of a god. And so the idea that one could have the full non-perspectival truth about anything is hubris. It is the hubris of 0-point epistemology. Yeah. So, let's see in chat. Yeah, it is a huge assumption to make. Which is also why at the beginning of our class, right, I talked about Walter Mignolo, making the case that I am, or I think where I am, right? I am where I think. This whole idea of my geography and where I think, where I speak from shapes what I say. And why he doubles down on that? Well, it's because he's going up against the hubris of the 0 point. So, why does that matter? Well, we will get to that in a second. But first, we've got to talk about Michael Hart, Antonio Negri's Empire. So I'm going to go through the argument very briefly, that that Castro-Gomez makes, and then I am going to talk about his response. All right? This is going to be a bit faster than last time around because I got a good half-hour practice, I guess. So, anyway, Hart and Negri's argument starts like this. Both imperialism and colonialism have reached their end because they're specifically modern phenomena. They were tools of the modern era, but they don't have a place in contemporary capitalism. And the reason for this is because they depended on material wealth and material production being the primary source of wealth generation. But as we have shifted to a knowledge-based economy, according to them, and shifted to a globalized society where now it's not that things are made in one particular area, but they're spread out in these huge supply chains that cross the globe, sometimes a few times over. Colonialism and imperialism don't make sense. If anything, they're an abstraction and an impediment to the generation of wealth. So this is their first point out of 4. The second point is that colonialism is directly connected for them to the formation of the European nation state. So nation states form because the practices that get normalized in managing a colony get imported back to the European kingdoms, and those ideas get then adapted and used on Europeans themselves. So the French have a colony on Martinique, and they learn how to do all kinds of stuff to people that they don't treat as people, and then they figure out, oh, hey, this is a very good way of managing labor here, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to throw it back in France, and we are going to manage our different areas or different classes or different estates, etc., in this way, because we can do it that way because we know that it works, because we've practiced on the colonized. Okay? This is point number 2, that the Enlightenment project of normalizing certain practices, of normalizing what makes the state good and that sort of a thing, this is what happens in the development of the European nation state. Point number 3. We move forward in time to industrialization. And this is what Castro-Gomez means by Fordism, or Fordist production. Henry Ford, the guy who developed, or at least utilized extremely well and efficiently for him, the idea of an assembly line and the idea of standardized parts. He is the one who gets sort of named here in terms of Fordism, but industrialization, this kind of standardized manufacturing-oriented type of economic development and economic production, leads to the use of colonialism in getting resources and labor. So you have colonization that allows for the wealth of the Americas to be taken to Europe, which in turn creates a situation by which Europe can industrialize, and then it needs not just gold, but now it needs resources. And while it already has these resources, so it can grab those resources from Puerto Rico or from Cuba or from Colombia, and then it can extract those and bring them back, right? So we have this back and forth there, right? And that process is how colonization works in the industrialized or Fordist world. Point number 4 that Hart and Negri argue. In a post-Fordist world capitalism is focused on knowledge, data, and symbolic manipulation. There's no longer a particular center for work, but globalization with no definable headquarters for empire. So, to give you an idea of this, let's say that you buy a computer. Let's say that you buy an Apple computer. Now, Apple was founded in California, Cupertino, and that's where most of their research and development happens, right there in California. But is it manufactured there? No. It's mostly manufactured in a number of factories in China. Are the parts all manufactured in China? No. That supply chain goes further because there are certain parts that need rare earth minerals. So those are mined elsewhere. And then they're refined somewhere else. And then they are assembled in another place. And then they are packaged somewhere else. And then they are shipped and sold somewhere else. And then, let's say that it breaks down. You take it to the Genius Bar at the mall. And they say, oh, hold on, I have to call somebody. And they call like a call center. And let's just say for the sake of argument, right? That call center that they refer to is not based in the United States. Let's say it's in Singapore. Or it's in Bangladesh or somewhere else, right? You are in just trying to, download Minecraft onto your computer, or for y'all, download Skyrim onto your computer, you end up having to cross the globe a few times over. There's no center there. There's no periphery. There's just this large, amorphous mass of connections of parts and services that bring you what you need to create knowledge, which in turn could potentially create more parts and services. The more valuable thing is the knowledge, not the parts, right? So there's no definable headquarters for what Hart and Negri term empire. Therefore, so here's the sort of big end on their particular argument, according to Castro-Gomez. Therefore, colonialism is a relic of an old form of capital that doesn't hold anymore. When capital had an inside, those who benefited from these things, and an outside, those whose resources were extracted, right? There is an inside to it, those who own the means of production and make things, and those are on the outside, right? Okay. Thank you for the arrow to the knee joke, Nathan. All right, so let's keep going. Castro-Gomez says, Without centers and without peripheries and without an outside, empire doesn't need the representation of the other to affirm its identity, right? Europe has its identity not generated in this positive sense of, hey, we're European, but we're European because they're not European. They are the other. They are the Arab. They are the Indian. They are the Latin American. They are, etc. Right? Whoever, they are the African. They are whoever gets deemed the other. Right? Another way of saying that is that there's no place for colonialism in this post-Fordist stage of world capital. Empire doesn't need colonization because empire is everywhere. Right? That's the argument that Castro-Gomez is attempting to address. He's not saying like this is wrong. He's saying it's missing something. So he is going to add what is missing. And he begins by talking about the genealogy, how empire develops is missing a lot of things. And he draws on Walter Mignolo for this. It's not possible to understand the humanism of the Renaissance, the scientific orientation of the Enlightenment, the efficiency of the industrialization period, without understanding the conditions, the historical conditions of possibility. In other words, the gold of the Indies, he says, makes the riches from America into, the gold of the Indies makes the riches of America, and this is America writ large, into the resources that Mediterranean Europe needs to develop into Europe. You don't get modernization without the resources and testing out of ideas that happens in colonization. So this is not unlike Quijano's point that modernization and colonization occur hand in hand. You don't get one without the other. He's arguing about particular theories of development. Here, Castro-Gomez is trying to unpack a particular argument as it relates to epistemology, and we'll get to that in a second. He also references something that we talked about last week, which was the myth of Eurocentrism, which is namely that the myth of Eurocentrism holds that modernity in Europe developed in this kind of linear and homogeneous way. And that model can be put into any area of the world, and it's totally fine. But what that doesn't do is really account for coloniality, because if you cling to this myth of Eurocentrism and you cling to this homogeneous development model, colonialism is derivative of modernity, not constitutive of it. So what does that mean? It means that colonialism arises out of a certain set of thoughts and a certain set of values rather than informs those values, right? It's not this mutual thing. So here's the key critique that Castro-Gomez makes. And then I've got three points for y'all, and then I'll jump through chat and see what questions you have. Also, I am watching this dude do gymnastics trying to, wow, that was like the horse thing that they do in gymnastics. He's trying to deliver a package and there's this fence post and he's just like flipping over it. It was really, really impressive. Anyway, here's the key critique. This is Castro-Gomez. He says, as coloniality is the other face, constitutive of modernity, Post-coloniality is the structural counterpart of post-modernity. But Hart and Negri only talk about the postmodern face of empire, ignoring its post-colonial manifestations. In other words, here's what the critique means, that the genealogy of empire that Hart and Negri put forward assumes the very type of development that they're trying to undermine, right? It's assuming a similar logic. And in that regard, it ends up being Eurocentric because it can't think beyond Europe as the kind of center. So it's saying, oh, there's no more center, there's no more periphery, there's just empire, but empire turns out to be European. Right? Empire turns out to be this very particular sort of a thing. Right? So, okay. 3 points, and then I'll jump to questions, okay? Point number 1. What can we get from Castro-Gomez, amongst many other things? Theories of development matter. It's not just about what happens, but how it happens. And what else is happening that we're not connecting, right? Theories of development matter because there are ways that we get to now that can be more or less ethical. They can be more or less inclusive. They can be more or less focused on everybody getting their needs met and living fulfilling lives. And so when we tell these stories in an incomplete way, as well-meaning as we want to be, we miss out on a number of significant details that can connect us to a much larger set of stories that are maybe more complex than we would like. If we tell simple narratives, oftentimes we end up conforming to those narratives that most suit our own interests and our own well-being. And that can be both positive and negatively, right? So positively, one could tell a story of I have, let's say I have a college degree, therefore I am owed a particular kind of job with a particular level of pay. I am owed this. Even though there might be somebody who does not have this degree, who has demonstrated a great amount of skill and experience and is much better suited to, I don't know, the type of job that I feel that I'm owed. I don't really like this example that much, but the reason I use it is because there is a simple narrative about getting a college education that buys into this idea. But we can complicate it quite a bit, right? Why is it? We can complicate it by thinking about the history and development of higher education in the United States and how it plays a role in either subverting or challenging or also making people conform to particular economic and political values over others, right? Which is certainly a thing that happens, and that's not me being like anti-higher ed at all. I love higher education. I love teaching college. I want to do it forever. Instead, it is a way of thinking about sorry, I got lost in thought. There was a bird outside. Instead, when we complicate this narrative, we begin to see that, economic forces are much bigger than just this pseudo meritocracy, right? This sort of I purchase a good life for myself by going into debt, getting educated, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. A lot more complicated than that. And in many respects, complicated in good ways. Um, but that's one reason why we should avoid complex narratives, right? We might assume ourselves to be better than we are. There's a negative aspect to it as well. We might assume that we are worse than we are. We might assume, that, because one thing is bad, the whole thing is bad. I was just reading in a book from last week, just reading in Coloniality at Large, a piece by Castro-Gomez where he talks about the connection to racial purity, right? Something connected to Quijano's work and Manolo's work. And Gross Fruguel. This idea that pushing a racial purity narrative, that if we pushing a racial purity narrative is dangerous, right? For all these naive reasons that we've talked about at other points in class, but also that this idea, this emphasis on purity, means that anything that is not 100% purely one type of thing is automatically bad. It's way more complicated than that, right? It is way more complicated than that. And how we arrive at complex situations in their complexity requires us to have theories of development that are able to deal with that complexity. I stand by a definition of good college education that a pedagogy professor, former president of Goucher College, Jose Bowen, that he says, the purpose of education is developing more complex cognitive maps to deal with more complex problems. And I think that that's very true. I think that's very, very true, right? Because these narratives of racial purity, especially in Latin America, right, where one is not European enough, therefore one is Moreno or one is Indio and one is less than, buy into logics that simplify for the sake of simplification and justifying a status quo that is oppressive, rather than buying into more complex narratives, more complex theories of development, more complex ways of understanding the world, more complex cognitive maps that allow us to think more deeply, more clearly, but also allow us to address and account far more things. If there is anything that philosophy is about, it ought to be that. Developing more complex cognitive maps. Foreseeing the world from not just one perspective, but many. All right, that was way too long on point number one. I'm going to go to point number two real quick. Knowledge work doesn't free the present from its colonial past. Just because, everybody's on a Zoom call now, or just because I'm essentially giving class via YouTube, doesn't mean that I live in a society that is free of its colonial past. It seems odd that this would bear some saying, but I think that it matters, because manipulating symbols, producing human capital, etc., these things recreate the conditions of coloniality, but in a different way. All you need to do to see this at work is to think about racial disparity in terms of those who get access to healthcare, those who get access to testing for COVID-19, those who live in areas where they have ventilators, where they have easy access to emergency rooms and healthcare and things of that nature. there is not just a racial disparity, there is a class disparity. There's a rural-urban disparity there. And these sorts of things didn't just pop up out of nowhere. These things happen for reasons, and they happen for a reason. These disparities, these inequities happen for a reason because particular ways of thinking and particular things, particular values get pushed, particular normalized and naturalized arrangements of society get pushed as though they are natural, as though this is the way things ought to be. Not even just ought to be, the way things are. Knowledge work, just because you're a code monkey or, excuse me, I'm not sick. I need water. Much better. Knowledge work doesn't free you from that. It's still part of that history. Point number 3. Quote unquote, new forms of knowledge draw upon indigenous wisdom, but get rewarded exponentially more than their sources and the peoples who defend those sources, who protect those traditions, arguably the guardians of biodiversity. Now, this is something that hits home pretty hard to that hits home pretty hard for Castro-Gomez living in Colombia, which is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And it's also home to a significant number of indigenous groups who have this kind of non-Western knowledge of non-sort of modernized knowledge of the world. And I don't say that to like fetishize them or be like, oh, you know, everybody's a witch doctor or something like that. No. What I mean is that there are peoples whose values don't reflect that of the world in which we live. And one of the things that they have valued continually is the care of the earth and the care of the diversity of the earth. And as a result, they hold in the Western mind many secrets that can be exploited, that can be used for profit. And oftentimes that happens without them being given adequate compensation. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week, but the point here being that these new forms of knowledge are, as Beck says in the chat, not very new. And we need to be mindful of the ways that this epistemological system that we might call the Western world, our Western way of thinking, that epistemological system, it leads us to devalue and disregard certain forms of knowledge and certain values that later on we might find important when it was important all along. And so it's crucial for those of us who are thinking through these ideas to be mindful of this, to be mindful of when the values that we are coming across are at odds with the values that shape and direct our behaviors. So, if you flip to the essay itself, Castro-Gomez answers the question at that he asked at the beginning of the essay. At the beginning of the essay, he asks, is there one world or are there many possible worlds? And he doesn't mean this in this weird sort of like logical way. He means it in a very practical and concrete way. And so he says this is I'm just quoting from the end of the essay. He says, Returning then to the question that opened this work, is there only one world or are there various possible worlds? It would have to be said that the conditions generated by empire, the colonial hierarchies of knowledge established by modernity, persist and make it difficult to think of a world in which epistemic plurality is recognized and appreciated. Capitalism is a machine that captures the proliferation of possible worlds and expropriates the production of other knowledges. For this reason, the multitude that Hart and Negri herald with such optimism is not possible or thinkable without an epistemological democracy, in which science stops being a slave of capitalism and the diverse forms of producing and transmitting knowledge can coexist and complement each other. I am referring to a world in which non-Occidental systems of knowledge can be incorporated into the curriculums of Occidental universities on equal terms in areas like law, medicine, biology, economy, and philosophy. A world in which, for example, the Yoruba cosmovision, the Buddhist cosmovision of Zen, or the cosmovision of the Kuna Indians can serve to advance towards a more integral science, more organic, more centered in the common good, rather than in the needs of capital. Perhaps then and only then we can move forward towards a world in which many other worlds would be possible. Yeah, so that's Castro-Gomez. That is, that's at least this article by him, and I think it's a crucial point to end on. If we are not looking at the ways in which knowledge can be expropriated, can be put to work for the things that we don't want it to be put to work for, we fail to see the dangers. We fail to see the dangers that lurk for the knowledge that we are trying to accumulate as human beings. So one way of thinking about it would be thinking about how a love of a particular culture or geographical region might end up participating in exploiting that culture and the peoples who produce and preserve that culture might end up exploiting them, might end up being complicit in not their well-being but in their ill. Something very much to keep in mind that goes beyond just like, don't wear a Selena shirt if you don't know what you're doing, for lack of a better example. All right, so that's what I got in terms of, like talking about stuff. I'm going to look through chat so I got to hook something up real quick. I'm going to look through chat so that I can see what you were talking about. So, besides Skyrim. Yeah. Yeah, so Wyatt, you have a question about what others think in terms of Descartes, and that is one of the big problems, is whether or not we can know what others think. We have to make assumptions, or we make inferences about them, but are deeply limited in those inferences. So even though he's trying to avoid solipsism, he nonetheless is very real close, if not just denying that his thought leads to solipsism. But I'm not a Descartes scholar. I'm sure there are others who would make the case, make a better case either for or against than I. Let's see. Skyrim joke. Okay, so question about which sort of chicken and egg, right? Coloniality and then modernity, or modernity and then coloniality? Um, Both and. They are mutually informing. Um, so a certain way of understanding the world is latent uh, within the thought of those who unite Spain, unite in very heavy quotey fingers. Who unite Spain and then who send Columbus on his voyage the to the Americas. But those resources then make possible the furthering of that thought and furthering of cultural institutions and things like that. So there is, on the one hand, um, a thought or a way of thinking that then turns to exploiting exploiting resources and peoples, which then in turn leads to further developments, which lead to more resources. So it's recursive. It's back and forth. You don't get one without the other, even though they are not the same thing. I mean, Chiquita, and not necessarily even Chiquita, but United Fruit. The United Fruit Company is not good. Just not good. And yeah, what you are referencing, Andrew, is the start of the term Banana Republic. Yeah. And I mean, if you're looking for a contemporary way of talking about it, I guess some of the dialogue that you will hear is about disaster capitalism, um, and how you can manufacture conditions that will make it better for you to make a lot of money, or um, or you can benefit from a disaster, um, that sort of a thing. All right. Beck is trying to fight people again. All right. All right. So Nathan's question: do I arrive at knowledge because I am thinking, or do I arrive at knowledge because of where I am and what surrounds me? Um, I am gonna go super phenomenological here, which is my want. It's what I wrote my dissertation on. It is, in many respects, my philosophical home. The shock doctrine, yeah, that's what it was. Disaster capitalism, shock doctrine, that sort of thing. Uh, Naomi Klein. It's all her sort of theoretical orbit. What was I saying? Right, going super phenomenological. Thought doesn't occur in a vacuum. Thought occurs, and what we mean by thought, we need to be specific. Reflection, whether on the self in terms of behavior, meaning, these sorts of things. Thinking about an experience one has, solving a problem, these sorts of things all involve thinking about something. In other words, consciousness is never just consciousness. It's always consciousness of. And in being consciousness of, there is always some object or something thought about. And in that regard, I am never already just thinking. I'm always thinking about something. And maybe when I'm thinking about my thinking, it's still the example of me thinking about what I did, thinking about something. So, what that means is that I am, yeah, you were exactly right, Wyatt. There is a both and on the horizon. It is not Hegel. This is Husserl. This is Husserl and this is Merleau-Ponty. So I exist within a milieu, an environment. And in that environment, certain things are possible for me and certain other things I don't see as possible. Action, movement, these sorts of things are possible for me on the basis of the environment in which I exist and on the basis of how I interact with that environment in my embodied form. So I can't ever just have knowledge. I can't ever just be like knowing or thinking something. There is always a relation to the world beyond myself that is going on. Yeah. So let's see. United Fruit Company bed. Hegel shaking and crying right now. I mean, it's Hegel's tough, but you know what? So is learning to drink your coffee the correct way, which is using a bird grinder, pour over method of some kind, and really good single origin beans, and nothing in it. You get used to it. It is an acquired taste. I despised Hegel when I was in undergrad. I look forward to reading Hegel whenever I've taught this class. It is wild that that happened, but it did. You get better at reading because you learn how you learn how things work. Hey, I was being facetious about coffee, Beck. I appreciate just about every form that isn't the devil's form, which is Keurig. That's the devil's form. Anyway, yeah, thinking is not possible without a horizon of meaning. Yes. A la what Alkoff was saying back when we were reading her so many months ago when we were all together in person. Yeah. Keurig nerds out. What? No. Keurig is awful for the environment. Coffee is a dessert. Coffee is a dessert. No, coffee is an essential service. Coffee is an essential service. And Alkoff as an epistemic hero, always and forever. Visible Identities is one of my favorite books. It's so good. It's so good. Well worth your time to read more of it than what we've read in class. Okay. I have gone for 48 minutes now. That's a lot. So how much sugar do you put in your coffee for it to be dessert? As much as Americans usually put in it. Anyway, I am tired of talking. And I feel like I've hopefully helped you work your way through this essay. We are going to be reading, for next week's live stream, we are going to be reading Sylvia Wynter. This is a picture of Sylvia Wynter. We're not reading something from this, but we are going to be reading an essay by her on coloniality and sort of an attempt to go be coffee after dinner. You are so young. Um, a can of coffee after 3. Or I will be up forever. Anyway, we're going to be reading Sylvia Wynter. It's going to be a blast. I'm super excited to get into it. The essay is in D2L, so you can check that out. Also, if you are not in the class but you are watching this and you want to join in, I have a link for being able to read the essay and to participate. I believe it's down below. It might not be, but it's in the ad. So anyway, I'm gonna head out. It was wonderful to uh, have you participate in this craziness where I gave a lecture twice. Uh, but I miss you all. I hope you're well. Wash your hands. Stay inside. Stay home. Don't gather. Don't be dumb. And be good to everybody. And I will see you later. Take care, everybody. Be well.